I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Janet Barger, who is going to be our president for the next year. Janet is a retired school teacher, middle school. She actually helped me.
High school.
High school. She's a recent grandmother also, believe it or not. And Janet actually assisted me several years ago when I was writing this children's activity book for the Dahlonega. I said, we don't really have anything that's, kid friendly to teach kids about the gold rush, history of Dahlonega and so on. So I put together like different activities and a little bit of history thrown in there. And she used her students as our guinea pigs because I figured that's the target audience. Let them be the ones to review it and give me some feedback, which they did. And so that way it came up to a nice finished product. So tonight, Janet will be regaling us with stories about who our county is named after, Wilson Lumpkin.
I didn't know how long the business meeting would take, but anyway, Wilson Lumpkin, I think we were all vaguely aware that the county was named after somebody, but didn't really know much about it. So hopefully we'll know more after this. If I can get this to work.
No? Oh.
It worked earlier.
Are you aiming it at the machine?
That's not it. Okay, right there.
All right. So he was born in Virginia near the Dan River, 1783. He was the second son of Lucy Hopkins and John Lumpkin. Moved with his parents to Wilkes County, Georgia, which is now Oklahoma, in 1884. Next. There we go. All right. They were among a group of Virginia planters who moved down after the Revolution. George Matthews, in this case, had fought in the area at the Battle of Kettle Creek and other places and saw rich land there. And so by this time, you have to remember, they've been growing tobacco in Virginia for over 100 years. And if you've ever seen a tobacco plant growing, you know how much it pulls out of the soil. They did not have the modern fertilizers then, so basically the soil was wearing out. So they were looking for new places to move. So they came down here. He and the others were granted 200,000 acres on the condition that he could bring in 200 families. This was something that was done. Mexico did the same thing when they got the Texas Indians. What I thought was interesting, along the Lumpkins were the Gilmer, Meriwether, Marks, Lewis, Tolliver, Crawford, Barrow, and Finzi families. Now, if you lived in Georgia long at all, most of those names are going to be very familiar to you. Why? Towns, yeah. So this was a very influential group of planters. I also found out, I was reading Lumpkin's memoirs, and the Finzi family, which doesn't mean anything to us necessarily, but a clerk in the Finzi was George Pascal, who was the husband of Agnes of Auraria fame. So of course he didn't live to move to Auraria with Agnes, but anyway, so small world. One other thing I wanted to mention real quick, the Marks family. John and Captain Marks, I believe it was Captain Ulysses, and Lucy Marks. You may have never heard of them, but you probably heard of Lucy's son, Meriwether Lewis. So when they came to Georgia, the young Meriwether came with them. Lucy's maiden name had been Meriwether. So he spent 2 or 3 years here on the frontier before he went back to Virginia to complete his education. So a lot of his frontier skills that will serve him well later as a member of Lewis and Clark, he learned on the Georgia frontiers. All right. So this was still frontier Georgia in 1784. There were a lot of Indians still living here, the Creeks, Cherokee. And his family was, quote, exposed to frequent depredations from hostile and savage Indian neighbors. He remembered having to take refuge in a fort in the area. I did a little bit of research. I could not identify there were several forts, but I could not identify a fort that was post-revolutionary. This led to the belief that the two cultures could not live peaceably together. But interestingly enough, he didn't necessarily feel the Indians were inferior. He certainly cultures, but he felt that they should be removed to Indian Territory, which was west of the Mississippi River, and then later, as they advanced themselves, they would be admitted as a separate Indian state. That didn't happen. All right. So, according again to his memoirs, he spent a lot of time copying papers and documents for his dad, who was clerk of the Superior Court of the newly formed Oglethorpe County. And by 16, he knew most of the statutes and the laws of the state of Georgia. And he could write wills, mortgages, and other legal documents. So that was his kind of segue into politics. But if you remember Lumpkin for anything, it was for his particular mission. And anybody want to guess what the particular mission was? Removal of the Cherokee, Georgia. And so why was he so adamant that the Cherokee be removed? Now, he was not alone in this, certainly. That was the majority opinion of folks at the time. But when I started kind of looking into it, there was some background for that feeling. All right. So a little brief history lesson on how the whole thing started. The Compact of 1802 was a part of the deal that Georgia made with the federal government when we agreed to give up all of our western lands. And most of you probably are aware that after the Revolutionary War, Georgia's western boundary extended to the Mississippi River. So that would have made a huge state. So too big, really. One of the times, that was before we had Texas and Alaska. So they gave up those eastern lands. There was a lot of corruption involved. I won't go into that. Most of you might have heard of the Yazoo land frauds. What?
Western.
Western. What did I say?
Eastern.
Sorry. Western. This was correcting there. So anyway, so that's what Georgia looked like. They split it out.
No.
No?
Wait a minute.
Maybe I'm going the wrong way. There we go. No?
Well,
Yep. Here we go. All right. All right. Well, the Compact of 1802 provided for the federal authorities to evict any remaining Indian peoples, and that was especially the Cherokee, but basically any of them, living within the state as soon as it could be done, quote unquote, peaceably and on reasonable terms. In 1813, which was a dangerous time, I think, to be moving around because we were at war with Britain again, if you'll remember, the War of 1812, which lasted for 2 years. Lumpkin, along with 4 of his Oglethorpe County neighbors, toured Alabama, what is now Alabama and Mississippi, with a view towards possibly moving west, because that was considered the West at that time. They found any Creek Indians they encountered to be sullen and unfriendly. They stopped at Fort Mims in what is now Lower Alabama for rest and supplies before moving on northwards and towards home. I was listening for the groans when I mentioned Fort Mims. How many of you have heard of Fort Mims? Okay, all right. All right. Shortly after Lumpkin and his party left Fort Mims, the Fort Mims massacre occurred, killing over 500 white men, women, and children. It is considered to be one, if not the worst massacre of white people in American history. I didn't research that to verify it. People in Alabama certainly think it's the worst one. But panic swept over the entire Southeast. If you've ever read Gone with the Wind, the book, the Fort Mims massacre is referenced in the book by Grandma Fontaine. Yeah. She was evidently one of the 4 or 5 women survivors of it, according to the book. All right, so, people went into a panic. And, they began to clamor for total Indian eviction. Even though the Cherokee had abandoned the warpath forever after 1795, they signed an agreement that they would do that, and they kept it. Yeah, do that. Wilson did not receive the news of Fort Mims until he had gotten back home. It was very upsetting, I'm sure, because he very narrowly missed being killed himself, because Indians killed everybody except they did not kill the enslaved people that were there. They let them go, and they captured 2 or 3 of the women and a couple of the children. All the rest were killed, though. So it was pretty bad. The Creeks were evicted by Andrew Jackson after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and the Cherokee remained, but efforts were stepped up to move them. And it was kind of sad because the Cherokee actually had supported Andrew Jackson in this fight. Okay. So all of this, his experiences as a child and his near miss of dying at Fort Mims, is going to kind of solidify his opinions as far as Indian-white relations. He did not think the 2 groups could live together. Politically, he remained independent of party affiliation until he entered Congress. However, he supported James Monroe for president in 1816 instead of his neighbor William Crawford, and that caused him to lose his bid for re-election 2 years later. President Monroe tried to compensate Lumpkin for his support by offering him several territorial positions. One was in Florida. He didn't want that. He ended up as commissioner surveying the Creek Sessions, and he explored the mountain area between Toccoa and what became Dahlonega. Gold had not yet been discovered here, of course. Not using my own thing, but I'm great with hands. So, all right. So, what people don't know that probably the majority of the Cherokee did not wait to be evicted. Especially the better educated ones, started moving west as early as the 1820s. The Ridge family, for example, those that did manage, those that did evacuate first or leave first, managed to establish themselves, and they acquired the best land and avoided the tragedies that came later. I'm not saying that they all should have gone early, but again, people like Elias Boudinot, who had been educated in New England. He was a member of the Ridge family, a very prominent Cherokee family. Elias actually married a white wife, a New England woman, and he knew. I mean, he had lived in white culture. He knew what was going to happen. So several others did too. So they probably most of them moved. The ones that remained, however, organized themselves into a government similar to the United States, built a town, New Echota. New Echota is just over the hill towards Chatsworth. If you've never been there, I would recommend you go. It's really quite an amazing place. It looked more like a New England village than a frontier settlement. The Indians living in New Echota were more highly educated than their neighbors as a rule. So, all right. But still, Wilson Lumpkin still felt that they should go on to the west. President Monroe refused to evict them since they had adopted white civilization, and also believed the state of Georgia did not have the authority to do it. His successor, President John Quincy Adams, felt likewise. All right. And I messed up the slide there, but if you'll look in the northwestern corner that's not colored in, that was the land that belonged to the Cherokee. And there is kind of the layout of New Echota. All right. Wilson backed Andrew Jackson. get familiar, Lumpkin, backed Andrew Jackson for president in 1824. Once again, not supporting his neighbor and local son, William Crawford. Crawford suffered a stroke during the election campaign and withdrew from politics. So Wilson wrote to Congress on Jackson's popularity when Adams began to clash with Governor Troup over the Indian issue. He was reelected to Congress in 1827, and Andrew Jackson won the presidency by a landslide in 1828. Both of these men were primarily elected because of the Indian issue. Both men firmly believed that Indians should be evicted from the eastern United States, and so that was the way they felt. Jackson's first annual address advocated Indian removal to the west, and it's interesting that both men said for their own good. They need to go for their own good. They'll be better off there. Everything will be happy. Lumpkin's congressional committee that he headed in Congress forthwith produced the removal bill of 1830. So he was that head of that committee that ordered the final removal. Georgia continued to insist they had jurisdiction over the Cherokee, and political allies of Lumpkin encouraged him to run for governor instead of another term Congress. So guess we did. Governor. Right, and that's pretty much how he got elected. You may remember from U.S. history the case of Worcester v. Georgia. Worcester was a missionary to the Cherokee settlement, and he brought the case in front of the Supreme Court on behalf of the Cherokee. The Cherokee had tried to bring the case to the Supreme Court, and the ruling was by Marshall they could not come to the Supreme Court because since they said they were a sovereign nation, the court had no jurisdiction. So Worcester bought it on their behalf and won the case. Marshall ruled in Worcester's favor. You may remember, and President Jackson's words when Marshall made that decision. Anybody remember that?
Marshall made the thing, let him enforce it, something like
Marshall made his decision. Now let him enforce it. So Jackson did not follow through with his presidential obligation to execute the law. All right. So all of the challenges went nowhere. Lumpkin was governor. Lumpkin initiated a series of harassments to the Cherokee, making his claim that he had their best interests. And under this harassment, one faction of Cherokee leaders finally signed the Treaty of New Echota on December 29, 1835. And you may know that the leaders that signed it were later executed by the Cherokee. Lumpkin's term of office ended in 1835, whereupon he was appointed Indian Commissioner and oversaw the Indian removal. His plan, if it had been followed through, was efficient and organized and, believe it or not, humane. The problem was nothing happened like it was supposed to. The troops that were supposed to come didn't show up. The transportation for the Cherokee didn't arrive. It was total chaos. And finally, he resigned because he didn't want anything to do with it. And by that, when he did that, he was appointed to the U.S. Senate in 1837. Remember, in this time in history, the state legislatures appointed the senators. They were not popularly elected. That's not going to be until the 17th Amendment. He served until 1841 when he returned to his businesses and plantation in Georgia, but he was very proud of himself about being the one that was responsible for removing Cherokee. All right, a little bit about his personal life. He was married twice. That was certainly not unusual in those days. Men would wear out one wife and then get another one. to raise the surviving children and perhaps have some more. And that's what he did. His first wife, Elizabeth Walker, they had 6 surviving children, and Hopkins, they had 3. This is what I did not know. The new railroad town of Terminus in North Georgia was going to be named Lumpkin in his honor. Instead, he asked it to be named Marthasville in honor of his youngest daughter, Martha Atalanta Lumpkin. Atalanta was a nickname. Apparently, she was something of a tomboy and would run. She would just run everywhere. So I, of course, knew that Marthasville was named after the president of the railroad, but I did not know it was Lumpkin. Didn't prep for this. Of course, he was appointed by the governor to serve on the State Board of Public Works. He was a key figure in the state's creation of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, serving as general manager. And of course, that's when Marthasville came to be. He was a staunch unionist during the nullification crisis of 1832. If you don't know what that is, I'm not going to go into it now, but we almost had a civil war in 1832. However, during the Civil War, Lumpkin supported secession. He died in 1870 and is buried in Oconee Hill Cemetery in Athens. His farm in Athens was deeded to the University of Georgia by his daughter, Martha, and is a significant portion of the campus. And if you know anything about UGA, one of the major streets through town is Lumpkin Street. Yeah, so. And there is his burial place, and in the background, of course, you can see San Francisco. So
I didn't know that.
and that's it. I kind of rushed through it, but I thought it would be, yeah. So anyway, any questions? I will try to answer. Yes.
You know how long the governor's term
Were at that time, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm going to assume 4 years. My math maybe not to add it up. That's not something I looked at. Yeah. They're 4 years now. I don't know if it's different then. As you know, Georgia had to write a new constitution after the Civil War, so they could have changed it then. Okay. Good question. I wish I heard it. Any others?
Yeah, can you mention something about that nullification crisis?
The nullification crisis had to do with tariffs. Congress imposed a huge tariff. The problem is most of the exports at that time I think 1832, I think at least 50%, it became more later, 50% of all American exports was Southern cotton. So the tariffs protected New England industries, but it just made things more expensive for Southern cotton growers whose machinery and stuff was at that time a lot of it was still being imported from England. So when this tariff got imposed and passed, it was going to really hurt the South, and the New England people were going to be.
Oh, I'm curious, so which way was this tariff?
I was going to say,
Which way was this tariff operated? There was a tariff put upon Southern cotton being
the
exported
tariffs put
where?
upon all imported goods.
To the United States.
Yes, to the United States, which made them more expensive. So.
But wouldn't it make the cotton look more attractive then?
No.
Within the United States?
No, because cotton was being grown in the United States.
Right.
That wasn't the problem. The problem was that the things that the South had to buy at that time were still mostly imports.
Yeah, the South had no industrial base.
No, I understand it, but I mean, they would have been buying things from the industrial North.
Well, at that time, the North was industrial, but a lot of the machinery was still made in England.
Yeah.
We had not quite flip-flopped over yet. Yes.
A lot of banking, virtually all the banking
Yeah, all the money was in
was
the
going
North too.
through the
Yeah.
north too.
Yeah.
So they had all the advantage there.
So it's not a good thing for the South. It just means that the South, kind of like inflation now, that just means they had to pay more for everything
Sure.
while not And one of the things that happened, and this is an important piece I didn't mention, in retaliation, England started putting high tariffs on Southern cotton. So then they began to look for other places to buy cotton, and one of the other places turned out to be Texas, which at that time was not part of it.
But that was largely the only income for the federal government. The United States was tariffs at that time, right?
That was a lot of it, and that was why we went to the income
There
tax.
was no income tax.
Exactly, and that's why tariffs were so contentious, though,
Yeah.
especially in the antebellum period, because the Southern, it was all agricultural, all agricultural. The economy was, it was a single crop economy, which is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's really, it was so dumb.
No,
You just are so smart overall.
I taught American history, so. Yeah,
How did Lumpkin County get its name? No, who it's named after now?
the state legislature, yeah, the state, I did, yeah, I didn't include that state legislature, when they started creating all these new counties, they started naming them after prominent people, like the Tollivers and the people that, a lot who were plantation owners. They were just rich folks, rich influential folks, so they were just, the state legislatures named counties.
Roughly when. And
Goodness, let me see if I can go back to this. See, that has some dates on that map. Generally, it was as they were created, so it wouldn't have been in one whack.
It was in 1832 because it was a
Thank you.
result of the lottery. And so 10 new counties were created out of Cherokee County, which was in existence for about 1 year
I'll get back.
in 1831. And so when they had the land lottery in 1832, 10 new counties were created and they all needed new names, and Lumpkin was one of those 10 new counties, just like Gilmer and Fannin.
Thank you, Chris.
well,
Yeah.
that was also much bigger than it is now.
Well, oh, yeah, the counties were divided from bigger counties and divided. Well, we have 159 counties now, which is more counties than any other state except for Texas. Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah.
Do you know why that is?
Why?
When they were making the counties, they had a rule that it had to be within 1 day's walking distance.
Oh,
Yeah.
Counties.
The county seat. had to be
Didn't know
within
that.
1 day's.
So for voting purposes, you had to be able to travel to vote on the seat. That's why there's so many small counties.
Apparently, the other states did not labor on that.
No.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll have horses they can travel faster.
That's true. It was not unusual for farm families in the interior to never have seen a horse. A mule, ox, but not horses. They were not as common as we think. Yes, the interiors. Okay, Dan? Yes,
Well, one,
please add.
my
Yes.
family was in pot. My ancestors, okay? And there was a lot of cotton people that went from Texas to Alabama. And back, I mean, there was a lot of trends.
There was a lot of going back and forth because, and again,
They
because
went to
the
the
land.
It went to Texas because of the high tariffs put on it here in Texas and Alabama.
Right.
It helps explain it.
Yeah. But there were a lot of people, my ancestors came down in another group from Virginia and settled on the, Moby River.
And Tolliver's my sixth grade.
Okay. And was Italian. I did not know the Toffers were Italian.
No, he wasn't. He was born here.
But I mean, the Toffers.
He got to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, they came from
Yeah,
Venice and moved to England. They stayed there a couple of hundred years and they came to
which I
Richmond.
thought was fascinating.
They came in the 1680s.
All right, anybody want to add? Any questions? There's a lot of knowledge out here. All right, well, thank you very much.
He didn't live in Oliver County.
Thank Janet for that wonderful program.
It should be fun.